And there are times when you should be afraid of God, and you should be afraid of His Christ, who is God and Lord and King of kings. Never forget that. You and Jesus ain't got your own thing going. Jesus is not your buddy. He loves you with a love that goes beyond poets. But remember who He is. He is your elder brother. But your elder brother is the Lord of glory. Now, how do we explain the fact that this word avenger is used of Christ, but in the context of the professing church? Well, I want us just to look at two things. First of all, the one committing sexual immorality. It is in the professing church, it is very possible that his practice of sexual, or her practice also, applies to women also. That his or her practice of immorality is just exposing a deeper root problem of unconversion, that this is a false convert. That could be the possibility. And in the case of a false convert within the church, Christ treats them as an unbeliever, and the justice is punitive and can be described as wrath. He will clean His church of such a person. But the text can also be referring to a believer. And in the case of a believer, this vengeance that the Lord takes will manifest itself in what we know of as redemptive discipline. But here's something that I want to point out. You see, when I talk about the Lord as the avenger and the Lord pouring out wrath on the unconverted in the church who's contaminating the church with its sexual immorality, when I use the word wrath, you have something of a fear, but you say, that doesn't apply to me. And so when I use the idea of discipline, you go, whew, that's not so bad. You've got a very poor understanding of discipline. You have a very wrong understanding of discipline. Because discipline in the people of God and in the church of Jesus Christ can be terrifying. Redemptive? Yes. But terrifying. I want to just read to you Hebrews 12:6. Just listen. Speaking about the believer and the Lord's discipline. For those whom the Lord loves, He disciplines and He scourges every son whom He receives. Mastigao. It means to beat with a whip. In the context of this area of the world and at this time, people were whipped. Not only in the Roman culture, but in many cultures. And we're talking about someone who is strung up with both arms spread out, their back made bare. Possibly they are tied over a log or a rock in order to expose the fullness of their back. And they are whipped until their back is shredded. And they had it down to a science so that they knew one more stroke will kill them. And therefore we stop. So when we talk about the Lord's discipline, I don't want you to just breathe a sigh of relief and think of it as a spanking. He truly knows how to discipline His people. Listen to another text in Hebrews, chapter 10, verse 30 and 31. For we know Him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge His people. And it is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Do you see what's being said here? Now, there's something in me that would be prone to say, I'm going to dissect this, I'm going to make it easier, I'm going to try to explain it away. But no, I want you just to hear the text. Because it is in the context of the believing community. And you need to know this. You need to fear sin. You need to fear sexual immorality like the plague. Worse than the plague. Because someone can die of the plague and it not be their fault. They'll not be held accountable on the day of judgment. But in sexual immorality, you will. You will. Dr. D. Michael Martin, New American Commentary, he says this. Now listen. The objects of this divine retribution are the members of the church who have violated God's commands and wronged the brethren. Divine judgment is inescapable even for those who are in the church. Salvation does not grant believers the right to sin without suffering the consequences. If we only had a handful of men that feared nothing but God and sin, it could turn the world upside down. Now, when is this time of avenging? Well, ultimately, it's eschatological. Ultimately, it's the final judgment when Christ will render unto every man according to that which is due him. There is so much about the final judgment of the believer that I cannot explain to you. I can't put it all together in a unified thought. So I believe that the best thing to do is hold it in attention. The fact is that we will stand justified before God. The fact is we will be judged. And each man will receive according to what he has done, rendered unto him. Not with regard to salvation, no. But with regard to something that is very important because it's repeated over and over and over again. I want you to know you will stand before God. You will be judged. Yes, His blood will make way for you. His blood is sufficient. But know this, you will stand before Him. And not just with regard to sexual immorality. Our slothfulness, the sins that we allow to continue on in our lives like weeds that we do not root out of a garden, on and on. I want you to know these things are to be taken seriously and you need to deal with them, and so do I. I would not be a minister of Christ if I stood up here and just basically told you, don't worry about the day of judgment, it'll be a cakewalk. No. You'll be peeled back and everything will be exposed. So understand this. It's a serious, serious thing. Now, I said that ultimately this vengeance is eschatological, but it also can be temporal. This has been seen throughout the history of the church. It's been seen in many churches, even as we speak here, and it's seen in the Scriptures. There are times when Christ simply comes. And He comes in judgment. This is specifically set out for us in the book of Revelation, chapter 2 and 3, when He is speaking to the churches in Asia Minor. He says some very, very hard things. And I want to give you just something from the church in Thyatira. Listen to what Christ says. But I have this against you, that you tolerate the woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and she teaches and leads my bondservants astray, so that they commit acts of immorality and eat things sacrificed to idols. I gave her time to repent, and she does not want to repent of her immorality. Behold, I will throw her on a bed of sickness, and those who commit adultery with her into great tribulation, unless they repent of her deeds. And I will kill her children with pestilence, and all the churches will know that I am He who searches the minds and hearts, and I will give to each one of you according to your deeds. Now look at that. And one of the greatest proofs that God is not among a great majority of evangelicalism today is because we do not see these kinds of judgments in the church. We don't see it. People go on in their sexual immorality, and there's affairs and fornication and adultery. And the church just goes on. But when the church is truly belonging to Christ, you can see terrible things, frightening things. God will expose it in a moment. Even though it's been a sin of years, He'll expose it in a moment and deal with it publicly. So that others will fear. So that other churches will fear and other believers will fear. You need to realize this. All of us need to make our way right with God. We need to take sin seriously. Paul says here in our verse, just as we also told you before and solemnly warned you. Now, there are two great truths that I want to point out for you here. First of all, notice this. This was a baby church. This was a very young church. And Paul had already taught them about the judgment of Christ in the church. It means that it was a foundational, fundamental doctrine of the Christian faith that should be taught early to the believer, especially with regard to sexual immorality. But let me ask you a question. How often do you hear this in the church today? How often do you hear that from the national pulpits? How often do you hear warnings to flee from these things because they bring the judgment of Christ? Another thing that we need to see from this text is Paul says, I solemnly warned you. And basically what he's saying is, I solemnly warned you then, and I'm solemnly warning you now. It was something that he did with regularity. It is something he saw need of, that we're constantly needing to hear what? Not only the songs of Zion that were justified by the blood, but we're also in need of hearing there is a judgment. There is a payday someday. And whatever sins have gotten root in our life, we need to deal with them now, especially with regard to sexual immorality. Now, Paul uses the phrase here, solemnly warned. It can mean to solemnly testify or to warn earnestly with a great deal of seriousness and passion. Now, I want you to think about this word, solemnly warned. It is the same word used in the book of Luke. When? When the rich man is in hell and he begs permission to step out of hell for just a moment in order to do what? In order to solemnly warn his brothers not to come to this place of torment. Now I want you to think about this. If someone had the opportunity and the will to come out of hell to warn someone they loved, how would they do it? Would they be passionate or dispassionate? Would they be earnest or would they be apathetic? They would have the greatest degree of earnestness. They would be like a man screaming at a child to get off a train track before the train passes. And this is what we have here in this truth. Paul is saying, I solemnly warned you. And I solemnly warn you again and again and again. Hebert says this, it was a warning intended to penetrate their conscience. One thing about preaching that's true, it is not just intended to inform. It is intended to pierce the conscience and transform. And that's why the preacher is so pitiful, because apart from the power of God, that's not going to happen. I pray tonight that the Spirit of God would do more than the words of some small preacher. That you would have some sort of a fear with regard to these things. You would avoid them like the plague. Calvin said, men's dullness is such that unless they are struck forcefully, they have no sense of the divine judgment. That's right. Sleeping. Wake up, sleeper. Wake up. Realize how awful this is. There's warnings all through the Bible with regard to sexual immorality. Let me just give you one. Proverbs 6. For why should you, my son, be exhilarated with an adulteress and embrace the bosom of a foreigner? And he's talking about sexual immorality. And then he goes on to say, for the ways of a man are before the eyes of the Lord, and He watches all his paths. There's nowhere you can go to commit these things that the Lord does not see you and take it to account. Nowhere. You can hide from your wife, you can hide from your friends, you can hide from a religious community. You can hide from all of us, but you cannot hide from Him. That all of us would have this hyper consciousness of the omniscience of God, because it is a great bulwark against sin. It will protect us. And then he said, His own iniquities will capture the wicked, and he will be held with the cords of his sin. This is terrifying. Held with the cords of sin. Bondage. And what does a believer have to do with this sort of bondage? Christ has saved us to make us free.